Good evening. Welcome back to our series on supporting anxious children. This is our third and final session of the series, and I just want to make a quick comment that if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. We have been embarking on a process of learning and sharing over these last two sessions, and that we've been shared a lot of important information and addressed great questions around our role in supporting our children. So if you have not been part of these sessions, we strongly encourage you to go back to the Learn Quebec website. We'll be throwing that into the chat and watch the replays, as they'll help you to sort of make sense of our conversation this evening and get the best, out of this series and the work that we're doing. For tonight, we're going to take some time to sort of recap some of our overall concepts. At the same time, we're going to be spending, the bulk of our time sort of addressing the questions that you've submitted throughout the series. So, let's just sort of jump in and get started because we have lots to share and get to. Just a quick reminder that we have some great resources on hand that we want to share with you guys. We've mentioned a lot of them already. Breaking Free from Childhood Anxiety and OCD by Ellie Leibowitz. This is largely the work that we're doing with you comes from the work of Ellie Leibowitz. This is a fantastic book, and if you're into listening to books, it's available in that way as well. Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents, also a wonderful read, The Anxious Generation. And we added a new one to the list today, Stopping the Noise in Your Head, The New Way to Overcome Anxiety and Worry. And this is really for us as adults, to kind of look at if this is something that we sort of want to dig into ourselves within our own sort of, profiles. So I'm going to pass it over to Zamira.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here again for the last time. We're hoping to really cover a lot of the topics that we talked about, but we want to sort of give you a little bit of a different take of the kind of concept that we were presenting. And the way I would probably start is to go to some of the questions that you guys have sent. We have many questions over the last three webinars, and most of the questions are something like this. How can I help my child with anxiety? What tools can I teach to reduce my child's anxiety? How can I make my child feel less anxious about something, tests, performance, separation, talking to people? And that kind of puts us, these kind of questions puts us in the role of fixer. We want to fix it. How can I help my child? How can I get them to do things that will take their anxiety away? How can I make them feel less anxious? And the whole sort of concept that we've been trying to convey to you is that the concept is not about you fixing your child's anxiety. It's about you as a supporter. How can you help your child through the anxiety? So the questions that you really want to ask is, how can I be supportive to my child? How can I support their anxious feelings? How can I help my child get through the anxious experience? And this is quite a different take on how we tend to intuitively think about helping our kids. So if we're going to take this supportive role and say that we are supporters, we have to think about it in that way. So one of the things that we talked about is validation. So anxiety is expected. In many situations, we are expected to feel anxiety. We are expected to feel anxiety when we're faced with an exam, or when we're meeting new people, or when we're leaving our parents for the first time when we're young and going to school. So anxiety is expected in many situations. And to try and make it go away makes it less likely that the child can handle it, right? If you just make it go away, then they're never going to learn how to handle it. But we want to validate it. So that's where validation comes into. We validate that anxiety comes and it happens and we all experience it. And it's okay. Now, being able to handle anxiety is not about not feeling fear or nervousness or worry. It's about doing it despite these feelings. And that's the message of confidence that we were talking about, how to allow you to be validating and at the same time give the message to your child that they can cope. A very, very important message. And this supporter role also includes gradually reducing accommodations, and we're going to touch on that a little bit more today. We had talked about it quite a bit last time. But I just want, again, to sort of frame it a little bit. What does that mean, being a supporter? And what does that mean to gradually reduce accommodation? Well, it gives, first of all, it gives your child the message that they can be okay. It also allows them to have the opportunity to handle the anxiety on their own, that they don't have to rely on you so much. And it promotes learning, confidence, self-reliance, and problem solving. So this is really the indirect effect. When we say reduce accommodation, it seems so, okay, we're going to reduce accommodations, and what will happen? These are the things that we expect to happen. And that's what we want really our kids to have in their sort of repertoire of abilities and skills, right? Handling their anxiety on their own, being able to feel okay, to feel confident, to feel self-reliance. There's never any parent who tells me they don't want these things for their kids.
Let me unmute. We want to run through a bit of a scenario with you. This is a real scenario that has occurred for me as a parent. And I think it's a fairly common one when we looked at a lot of the questions and, pieces that people wanted to know more about. The idea of anxiety and fear at bedtime came up. So we'll run through this fairly typical supportive response, okay? But remember, I'm using a specific example, but it doesn't really matter what the nature of the anxiety is. The process of support is the same. So if you have a different scenario in mind, that's okay. Think about the scenario that we're going to play through. So it goes like this. My 12-year-old son, he can become nervous, anxious, uncomfortable, scared at bedtime. Pretty typical. We were also asked to share an example that is a little bit more typical and not so extreme, okay? So I want us to pay attention to how we remain an observer of our child and their anxiety, rather than getting absorbed by the specifics of the anxiety or the content of it, meaning like the actual thing that is making them anxious, right? It's not as important as we might think. So remember, we sometimes think that the more information we can gather, the better, which is often not the case, right? Anxiety is looking for certainty, which doesn't really help the process. So when we get absorbed by the anxious reaction, we are more likely to become fixers, negotiators, explainers, deniers, right? We get sucked into the anxiety and we move away from that supportive, process-oriented work, which is when your anxiety shows up, how do you notice it? How do you respond to it? How do you handle it? How do you move through it? So that's the space that we really want to work in. It's not about questions and drilling about the anxiety itself. Okay, so let's see if you can recognize what I'm saying in this sort of following scenario. So it looks like this. It's Remembrance Day. So this just took place. Bedtime routine is underway. Remember, my son is 12 years old. All the while, he's telling me about these intense things he's learning about the day at school regarding the world wars. He's got a lot to say. He's got a lot of facts, and he's got a lot of stories. And I'm about to tuck him in. He predictably says, because oftentimes our kids' anxiety is fairly predictable, and I'm bracing for it. He says, "Mom, I'm scared." Right? So in this scenario, I know the topic of discussion of the day has frightened him. So I say, yeah, I can see that. He says, yeah, all that talk about the war and the things that are happening, they really scared me and they're making me feel bad. Now I move into the validation and acceptance. And I say, yeah, that's scary stuff. It can be hard to hear about all those things. Notice that my tone and my pace, it's important, right? I'm not alarmed. I'm not overly concerned. We've been down this road before. So my tone, my pace, my presence communicates that your worry is not too much for me and that it makes sense. So my son continues and says, yeah, but I don't feel very good. I don't like what this is making me think about. And I say, well, that makes sense, right? Having scary thoughts in our mind, especially at bedtime, that's not fun. And note here, I didn't ask, well, tell me what you're thinking about exactly. Tell me what's making you scared. I'm avoiding those questions intentionally because it's not as important. I want to stay within a process of how do we work through. So my son says, it's going to be hard for me to fall asleep. My belly feels yucky. I say, yeah, it might be. Falling asleep with a yucky belly is pretty tough. And in comes my piece of confidence, okay? And I say, and you've been in this position before. You're familiar with it, right? Your worries, they show up, doesn't feel good, and you work through those feelings and you remember that just like every other time, you eventually fall asleep, right? These are just sensations. They won't hurt you. They just feel yucky. And he says, yeah, I just don't like it though. He's looking for me to fix this, right? And I say, I know. And you have some of your own tools that you can use to help yourself through this. Now, I'm going to pause the scenario here because we had many questions about what is the use and what is the value of like mindfulness techniques and breathing techniques and relaxation strategies, and are they useful to teach? And the answer is yes, they're useful to teach. Right? I have no real expertise in this area of mindfulness and breathing and whatnot, but I have taught my children that the way we breathe is powerful and it has the ability to bring down the intensity of our anxious reactions. So I remind him, check in with your breath, slow down your breathing. Remember, it tells your brain to also relax. So he starts to do it because we've been down this road before. So he engages in a strategy he's familiar with. And then he says, oh, but it's not working. My belly still feels funny. And this is where I help my son to understand how anxiety works. Not more questions about the anxiety. I'm saying, yeah, of course it still hurts. Your breathing doesn't make your worries go away. It helps you to get through it. Again, just like you've gotten through these feelings and sensations every other night. And I know you got this, and I know you'll be okay. He needed a few extra hugs before I left his room that night, but I did. I left, he fell asleep, he did okay. And I want to point out that we've been practicing this for a while. This isn't we don't do this once and we don't have to do it again. This is part of the ongoing, when we have an anxious response, this is the dialogue. This is the way in which we can provide supportive statements and be supportive in general. And it's something that we manage and we build capacity around, right? It's not something we're looking to get rid of completely because we know it will come back. That's how anxiety works, right? But on the flip side, when we step out of this supportive role, when we step into one that's trying to drill into the anxiety itself, we may start trying to fix, accommodate, overly reassure, and it might look something like this. If we take the same scenario, Mom, I'm scared about what I learned today about the war. Oh, honey, you don't need to be scared. There's nothing to worry about. You're safe. There's no wars here. So there's no validation there, right? There's no acceptance there of his reality. And he'd say something like, but I'm scared. I'm really scared. Okay, tell me exactly what you're scared of. Okay, now I'm getting stuck on the specifics of the anxiety. I want to avoid that. So by asking children to explain and be specific and go into details about the fears and what's driving it, it can lead us back into that negotiating, negating, continuing to overly reassure and say something like, but like I said, it's very unlikely and I promise you have nothing to worry about, right? We're trying to provide certainty in that questioning or that statement, and certainty is what anxiety is looking for, but we can't actually provide it. We could even be dismissive, like, I told you there's no danger here. Now you need to go to bed, right? There's not a lot of confidence or validation there either. It could look like something like, I think this is too much for a kid your age to even be aware of. You never should have been talking about this in the first place. Again, we're moving away from validating. And if the worry continues, and it probably will, parents may resort to further accommodations like, staying in bed with their child until they fall asleep, or allowing their child to get up and watch TV to calm down or to get their mind off things, or just come sleep in my bed. You're too worried. And all of this conveys a lack of confidence that your child can work through this. And it says, I don't think you can handle this. And my last point is Some of you may be thinking, well, in your scenario, your child was able to tell you what was bothering them. Mine aren't able to articulate that. And to that, I would say, when it comes to our support, it doesn't matter what your child, if they can or cannot express that worry. We want to know, we're curious, it's part of our nature. But 2 weeks ago, my son had a very similar loop, right? And he expressed that he had no idea what was making him worry, which was probably true. He couldn't tell me, right? But again, we went into these supportive statements, this confidence, and the process remained the same. So think about your tone. Think about avoiding asking questions that get you both stuck in the content of the anxiety. Instead, remain that observer and direct your child towards that. When worry shows up, how do we respond to it? So I'm curious to just, sort of open up the chat a little bit and share with us, maybe you have thoughts about the scenario that I expressed. Maybe you want to share some of your experiences of using these approaches, of using supportive statements, of reducing accommodations. Let's hear what people have to say. So one person says, my 6-year-old won't go to a birthday party without me staying. And I can't do, for example, a dance or ballet class where I stay in the building, but I can be in the room. How can I help her feel okay without me? That's a really great question. She's not feeling really okay without you. And in these moments, we want to reduce those accommodations. Maybe the birthday party isn't the place to start, is my thinking. Maybe we need to make a smaller step before we could leave her at a birthday party. Is she able to sort of, stay with, a trusted person, a less busy, scenario, a place where she feels a little bit more comfortable because it's a little bit more predictable, and we can build up to her ability to stay within, a larger context.
And I would add to that because sometimes this is what parents are thinking of, the big thing that they would like to change within their child's behavior or the child's ability. But there are often other things that are in the same category of them not wanting to be without you or doing things on their own and doing things in a particular way that can be addressed before you address those big things. And one of the things we like to tell parents is to start slow. Just start slow. Behavior change takes time. Just try it out. Try something out. It's not cut in stone. You try it out. Leave room for the possibility that it won't work, right? Not everything works immediately. And then try again. We as parents, we also have to persevere and persist and tweak it a little bit. If you've tried something and it didn't work or it went way too much and you feel, this did not go well, then try it a bit differently. This is not a way of handling something in a way that's so fixed and regimented. You can be flexible around. And you know your child well. In fact, when we sit with parents and we kind of figure out, okay, how do we start taking away accommodation? It takes a bit of time because every parent is different, every family is different, every child's anxiety might be manifested different, the temperament of the child might be different. So just try it out. The success comes from just doing it, just trying it out.
Leslie writes, we use the deep breath to calm down and it works well for all the kids. My oldest would get overwhelmed by deadlines and start crying. So I think the technique of validating his feelings first will help. Yeah, it really does help to start. If we just start with, a strategy, right, that we can be sort of jumping the gun a little bit, right? We want to start with our child really feeling like, you understand what's happening here for me. This makes sense to you, even if it's not making sense to me, right? And I have someone in my corner who's believing me and understanding me. That's really, really important. Um, my daughter checks in at bedtime, looking at that reassurance of second good nights. We've reduced the accommodations from 20 to 15. There is still some bedtime anxiety. It's a tiny bit better, but we do feel the anxiety still on both ends.
I would really like to address that because often, first of all, it's great that you started reducing it. Going from 20 to 15, that's quite an achievement, right? So because from 15 you go to 10, and from 10 you go to 5, and etc. So that's already a good start. But often we measure our success in doing something by whether by the feeling. If the child or your child is telling you they're less anxious and they're telling you, oh, it wasn't so difficult. Yeah, I felt a bit better. That's when we feel we were successful. But in this case, we do not really measure it by how the child feels. Not that we want them to feel anxious for the rest of their lives, but the success, especially in the first instances that we try this, is measured by the behavior, not the feeling, not the anxiety. So if your child was able to go to bed, their behavior was able to be successful by going to bed only with 15 instead of 20, well, you've been successful, at least to some extent. We
Yeah.
often want our kids to come back when we send them to school and they're anxious and we give them all sorts of, ideas of how to handle it. We want them to come back and tell us, no, it was actually great. I didn't feel so anxious. Actually, school's not, it's not as bad at all. But sometimes they don't. They come back and say, oh, you made me stay in school. I wanted to come home and I had a terrible afternoon because you didn't let me go home. And I didn't even stay in class and I didn't even learn. You see, you should have just let me go home. It was a waste of time. I felt terrible. In fact, I was crying the whole time. Sometimes they really go overboard, right? But that is not how we measure the success. We have to tell our kids, well, you stayed in school. That's already step number one. And ultimately, maybe they will come back and say they felt fine and they weren't that anxious. But initially, it really goes with the behavior, and we have to convey that to our kids.
We had a comment, it helps me to think of facing fears and the idea that avoidance just allows the anxiety to grow. Still, it's hard to always stay calm and not feed into the anxiety. For sure, right? We're humans too. We have emotions. We have big days. We're tired. We're overwhelmed. And trust me, when I, read that scenario, it sounds all well and calm. And in that moment, it was. But they're not always like that, right? There's times where, we want to push them through, like in a different way, or we want to just give in and make it fix it in the moment, right? But we know that our response, which is why I mentioned tone and presence, right? It's really important. It conveys a very, very strong message, but we also have to give ourselves, a bit of a break. We're not going to get it right all the time. We're not going to, feel great after every sort of intervention or experience with our child. And that's okay, right? That's okay. We're human too. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Or we can actually jump into a couple of questions that was sent when people registered.
We can do that. We do have some questions, but I'm going to save them for the next part around sort of more difficulties and challenges, Samir, where I think they'll fit in well to dive into that. So go ahead with some of the other questions we had previously.
Yeah, so some of the questions that really resonated were, what happens if my child has a reaction when they're starting to escalate with their anxiety reactions, or other questions related to the fact that parents feel bad at seeing their kids become more and more anxious when they're not accommodating, right? So the go-to thing is to de-escalate the feeling of anxiety. And as parents, we want to take that away. And we're being very good. We're trying to take away the accommodation or reduce the accommodation, but then our children react even more, and that their distress is affecting us. So we had some questions regarding that sort of experience that the parent is feeling and how the parent needs to be able to, what do I do in this situation? So there's a couple of sides to that, there's two parts to it. First of all, we have to prepare ourselves to the inevitability that this might arise in us, and we have to take care of ourselves and our own anxiety and address our anxiety around these situations. But I think one of the other things that we need to keep in mind that if your child is upset, if your child is crying, if your child is experiencing, the effects of whatever it is that they're manifesting in their anxiety, they're still okay. And kids can be upset, nothing will happen to them, and you are still good parents. You remain good parents, even if you have a child in front of you crying and upset because you weren't willing to accommodate their anxiety. And if you keep that in mind, that will help you figure out how you yourself, just like your child, need to get through this. You're doing the exact same thing that your child needs to do. You need to experience it to be able to get through it. I hope that answers the question. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I'm going to answer a question that came to us earlier about reducing accommodations. And the question was, how do I make sure my child doesn't feel unloved when I reduce accommodations? And I think that's a great question, because this can be a sudden departure from what our kids are used to, right? And they can sort of misinterpret this as harsh, as unloving, as unexpected. And we talked last week about the importance of involving our children and making sure they understand and engaging them in this process of what we ourselves are going to do differently, right? That we're not springing it on them sort of out of nowhere, which can lead to, feelings of, confusion and upset. In the book that we have shared with you by Ellie Leibowitz, he talked about how to engage in a process of bringing this forth to your child. He really advocates for writing a letter to your child, explaining, where things are going to go from your perspective going forward, how you're going to start responding differently. And I'm going to read you a short excerpt, and you'll find additional ones, in the book, whether in print or in audio. And it goes something like this. Dear Adam, we love you so much, and we're very proud of the way that you've been handling everything this past year. We also see that sometimes it's hard for you when you're not very close to us. We now realize that our behavior so far, for instance, making sure that you always know exactly where we are and staying close to you at all times, is not helping you at all. We think it's actually making things worse, because we're not giving you the chance to see that you can actually be alone sometimes. That's why we've decided that from now on, after school hours and on the weekend, we are not going to accompany you to different rooms in the house, and will not announce where we are. We will also close the door when we go to the bathroom. We promise that we will not leave the house without telling you. This might sound hard at first, but we are 100% sure that you can handle this. We are not angry at you and not trying to punish you. We simply care too much to allow your worries to hurt you in this way. We're always here to help you, but our help can't be by giving in to your fears. We love you so much, Mom and Dad.
That's an example of one kind of letter. You don't necessarily need to sort of give it for them to read. The letter is really for you to read to them. Obviously, if you're doing it with very young kids, they might not be able to read a letter on their own. But the rationale is that you're preparing them in a very loving and kind way for them to understand that the change that you're going to embark on is not a punishment. It comes from love and comes from a place where you feel it will help them grow and do better.
Mm-hmm.
And there are reactions to this. So maybe this is a good time to jump into some of the difficulties that may arise when you do make changes, even when you do this sort of thing. So there are several things. So children can still feel anxious. I think we addressed that a little bit. And then there's tantrums, aggression, threats, anger, and anger outbursts. And this can happen even before you actually reduce the accommodations. sometimes kids, just by reading such a letter, even though it's very lovingly done, they can have a reaction to the actual announcement that you're going to do this. They might realize that you're not going to do the things that you've been doing, and this elicits a lot of sort of feelings in them. And kids who are dysregulated may actually become aggressive or have a tantrum. But it's very important for you to remember that you don't need to get mad at them. If they don't want to listen, if to the letter or to the announcement, if they throw a tantrum, that's okay. You're not going to force them. You're not going to get mad. You're not going to punish them. You can, if it's a kid at an age where they can actually read, you can actually leave the letter and just move away and disengage and try again later. They might take the letter and sort of throw it away, but you obviously will have a copy for the next time, and you just try again. These reactions can happen in kids. But that doesn't mean that you failed or you can't proceed now. You just try again. Remember what I said, we must persevere ourselves and expect that this might happen. It might not work immediately. In addition, when kids do show aggression, sometimes it's because we tend to sort of argue with them about it. So you have to be really mindful that if they start to say, no, I don't want you to do this. Why are you doing this? I want you to come with me. I want you to be with me. I can't do it. And you then continue sort of to talk to them about it. You're sort of giving them the message that it's up for debate. So it's very important to disengage. This is not a debate. This is not a negotiation. This is what we are going to do. And again, the supportive statement needs to come at that point. We know this is hard, but we know you can do it. Because the more and more we allow that engagement to come along and we sort of go back and forth, think of a ping pong game. You throw the ball gets thrown back again, right? We need to not throw the ball back, because the more it gets kids more and more frustrated, because then they think that if they have these conversations and nag long enough or debate with you well enough, then you'll relent and you will continue to accommodate. And the analogy that I like to give in this situation is an example of, if your child, for example, if you have a young child and they say, I want you to buy me something that costs $10,000, right? Some toy or some gadget or something. It's $20,000. You would not debate this with them. You would just say, no, I'm not buying this. You would look at them in a puzzled way and say, of course I'm not going to spend $20,000 buying you this thing. This is ridiculous. This is just a toy, or this is absolutely unacceptable. We have no problem cutting the conversation away and saying this is not up for debate. Same if you have a 10-year-old kid and he's saying, oh, can I drive the car? You're going to say, no, absolutely not. I am not going to let you do that. And it's not up for debate. And so it's kind of that approach. It's not up for debate. It's absolutely not something we're going to discuss, whether you like it or you don't like it. And then we must look into ourselves and remember we're going to feel very upset maybe because our kids are upset. But we're going to have to handle it just like we're expecting our kids to handle it. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Now, aggression can be problematic. If there's a bit of aggression and you can just disengage and maybe go away and the aggression is not dangerous in any form, that's the best way to do it. The aggression can become dangerous when there's a safety issue, then the first thing that you need to do is deal with the safety issue. But if you have a kid who's reacting in such a way that creates a safety issue, that kind of tells me maybe this is something that you need to rethink how you're doing it or get help in order to do it with support. Maybe this is not something you can embark on your own, or you need to start with smaller increments. So let's stop there and see if there's any questions regarding this before I go on.
Yeah, there's a question. It's less about sort of tantrums, but it was more about maybe the negotiating and it being sort of a debate or even this sense of reassurance. Okay. How can I help my 12-year-old son manage the pressure he puts on himself and cope with feelings of guilt or embarrassment, especially when it seems like he's looking for immediate reassurance? For example, he'll text me from the dressing room while he's still with his team saying, I'm so stupid for taking that penalty, or from school saying, I'm embarrassed about a bad test mark. Should I just ignore, when you're talking about ignoring, should I just ignore the text or advise him not to text in these situations or take away his phone? What do I do there?
What I would suggest is this is a reaction that he's having for not doing well, whether it's embarrassment or it comes from his anxiety that people are thinking that he's no good, that he took a penalty, that he didn't do well on his test. And these are normal things. These are all normal things that we experience. Nothing is always working the way we want it to. We are going to fail sometimes. We're not going to always do the right thing, even on our teams, even when we try. So it's something he needs to work through. So for me, the way I would address it, if it's in a text, is I know it's very hard. It's very hard. You feel disappointed right now, but I think you're going to be okay. Just a supportive statement. Same thing. If he's waiting for you, probably the sort of texting that has been initiated comes from him wanting to reassure him and tell him it's okay, it's just a little penalty, nobody's mad at you, nobody's going to judge you, it's just a little test, so, you're going to do better, you're really, really smart. He's waiting for that reassurance. And if those of you who were here last webinar, we talked a lot on how reassurance is one of the things that we do a lot with kids. This is one of the ways we really try to mitigate fix the anxiety by reassuring. But then the child depends on that reassurance. And we want your child to be able to reassure himself, for him to be able to make a mistake and get a penalty and say, okay, it sucks. I don't like doing it. It happens, but I'll get through it. It doesn't feel good, and it won't feel good maybe next week either, but I can get through it, and I'm still a good team member, and maybe next time, it will be somebody else who gets the penalty. But this is a team, and this happens. So if he can do that for himself, then he's able to handle his anxiety a little bit better.
We had a few questions. Maybe we'll jump down a little bit onto in your list, Samira, of addressing difficulties. We had a few questions around the vein of panic attacks. My child worked themselves into a panic attack. I was using supportive statements, but attempts to get them to use breathing to calm down. It didn't work. Another example, my 13-year-old had a panic moment the other day and said she felt like she couldn't breathe. How can I assist in these moments when it feels really big?
So when kids get to the point when they're panicking, is because they haven't yet figured out how to handle it, right? They're at the stage, if you're feeling anxious, you get through it, you don't like it, and you get through it, well, you felt anxious and you got through it. Panic attack is you not being able to get to that stage where you're feeling, I can get through it. And that's what brings on the panic attack. It's not the anxiety that they're feeling, it's the belief that they're not going to be able to get through it, that this is going to be the worst thing ever. And sometimes what happens with a panic attack is that we tend to jump in even more, because the distress that a person feels really almost makes it impossible for us to stand by and just ignore that, right? So in those kind of situations, if your child is a young child, or if your child is really struggling, then you can soothe them. You can definitely soothe them. You want to be mindful not to soothe them with something that's accommodating. So let's say it's a lot of reassurance that they want. So maybe not use verbal reassurances in soothing them. Maybe it's a hug. Maybe it's caressing. Try to find something that's a little less in the area of the thing that you've been accommodating. But yes, you do need to soothe them and help them and support them. And then rethink how you can sort of reduce the accommodation or do whatever it is that you wanted to do with a smaller increment, right? You have to sort of kind of be a bit of an investigator. Okay, my child right now cannot handle this. This is way too much for them. I'm not going to put them through this again, but I'm not going to give up either. I'm going to break it down to a smaller increment or start with something a bit different and work our way up to this particular scenario or to this particular situation.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, in general, we had questions about, when it's really big, what I say isn't working, right? And to Zamira's point, words are pretty difficult at this time, right? They're not really going to get through. Our presence, right? Our reassurance, we call that co-regulating, right? Think about when your child was an infant, right? Babies really need us to co-regulate their bodies. We're lending our bodies to them. So in those moments when we can think about lending ourselves to our children, not with our words, right? Or when we're speaking with words and trying to reason or rationalize, this is usually not very helpful when they're so heightened, but being able to be present with our presence, as Zamir said, maybe it's with touch, it's proximity, it's being close, it's our physical presence that can have that reassuring effect to sort of bring them back down.
And with a panic attack also and these extreme reactions, we also sometimes, I have parents who say the child engages in emotional blackmail. They will say things like, I don't love you anymore, or you don't love me. You're, really things that can hurt us, but it's very important not to take it personally, because the anguish they're feeling in that moment can make them say things that, that are a bit out there. And really, if you think of it, they're just telling you, I don't like this change that you're making. This is hard for me. And this is what they're doing by these reactions. They're telling you that this is going to be very hard for them. So you need to be empathetic, and you need to validate it, and you need to figure out how you can offer them comfort without actually backing away completely. And that's where we go back again to make it doable. Try something small. Don't start something big. Just really small little things. You have to say 20 times good night. Now it's only 18 times or 15 times. That's a really good way to start. Yeah. So I'm going to go. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Shall I continue with just the next point, and then
Yes.
we'll jump into another question?
Yep.
So the lack of progress and difficulty to persist, we talked about it a little bit. So the difficulty to persist comes sometimes from our own inability to handle it. But sometimes it is very difficult. Not all kids are going to respond the same. Not all kids are going to show you the progress even after a couple of weeks of trying. Some kids have very severe anxiety, or sometimes they're just dysregulated, and they do tend to have these panic attacks and the aggression and the threats, and it's just really difficult, even if you're persisting and you're seeing that there's no progress. And those times we do tell parents, if you're doing this on your own, you need help. Either a help from a professional, but sometimes a help from somebody else that we call supporters. So it could be a grandparent, a good neighbor, a good friend, a sibling, sort of an uncle or an aunt. And these people in your life can help you deal with it. So for example, the question we recently had about the child not wanting to be alone at a birthday party, maybe at some point, this is where you bring in a supporter. You bring in maybe an aunt, and you're not there, but the aunt is there. They're going to be there to help deal with the situation. Or if you have a kid who's really tantruming and it's really taxing you, and you know that this happens every day around bedtime, then maybe you can ask, a family member to be there sometimes, so you can step out and take a break and have them support you through the tantrum. So you don't have to deal with it, because it is very taxing on us as parents.
We have a question saying, any suggestions for when my child frequently shows up at my bedside in the middle of the night after a nightmare or simply from waking, and their strategies to help them settle themselves back into their room before they come over to our room? So far, we're switching between bringing them back to bed over and over, or we let them sleep in our bed when we're barely awake ourselves, trying to understand what's happening. So I can relate to this very well. I think what I notice in this comment or question is there is a level of inconsistency that we can engage in as parents. I appreciate we're half asleep and we can sort of just pull a child into our bed. But when some of the times that happens, and some of the time we sort of insist that they go back to their bed, and we walk them through that supportively, we are still, it's still sort of that negotiation thing that Zamira was talking about, but perhaps without words. I can do it sometimes, I can't do it other times. So I think with this one, there's a part of us that has to sort of say, like, okay, when I feel this little body, as hard as it is, if I want to work on this and move it forward, I have to make that decision that I'm going to stop letting them come in my bed. Right. So then I'm taking them and I'm taking them back. I'm being supportive. I'm saying, I know it's hard when you're not with mommy at night. I know it's hard when you wake up, and, we can do this. I'm going to tuck you back in. Here's your tutu, here's your, and I'm going back. It also makes me think about when we prepare our children for what we're going to do, right? And those letters, or that example that we gave, when we have decided that we're going to reduce an accommodation, right? We have to really stick to that, right? So when we decide this, we're not letting this happen anymore from our vantage point, this is the behavior I'm going to change, right? We're sending mixed messages when we do it sometimes and we don't do it other times, which really sort of disallows our child to gravitate towards this new reality.
And yes, sometimes these things, I'm going to stop sharing. These type of things, sometimes they end up being very difficult at the beginning. And you almost have to gear yourself, especially if it's kids who don't sleep at night, and things are really difficult, and you might have a few sleepless nights. But in the long run, it pays off. So if you can persist through some sleepless nights, and the sort of realization that you are going to have to get up at night, and you are going to have to put them back into bed, and you might be tired the next day, it pays off in the long run, because then you will have a child who sleeps in their own bed and you sleep much better. And that's where supporters come in. Sometimes it's alternating between which parent does it. And sometimes it's really, if you have somebody like a grandparent who can actually come to the house and replace you for one night, that can be wonderful and help you get through it. And maybe you do this, during a time where there's no school, during, winter break, where it's easier to handle a bit of lack of sleep. Yeah. So we have I'm just looking at we have about 10 minutes, and there were some questions that I really wanted to get to that people had sent in. Is there any question that you see in the chat that we should address before then, Jana?
We can jump into some previous questions and then maybe go back to the chat.
So some of the questions that one of the questions that I want to address is, people have said, when do I know when my child needs professional help? These things, we're asking you to do this on your own, to read the book, to listen to maybe the webinar again, to try and tackle this on your own. And it may help. I'm sure it will help to some extent, and definitely if you have mild anxiety. But it's a very good question. At some point, when is that point where you can't handle it on your own? So there's a couple of situations. So first, if your child is extremely, extremely anxious, meaning that they have, real difficulty functioning in general because of their anxiety. So this is not kids who maybe have, anxiety around bedtime, but they still go to school and they're still hanging out with their friends. These are kids who are really, your child is really struggling with everything, and you feel like it's really taken over. Then I would definitely suggest that. In addition, if you've started doing these things and you've been working on, changing things, and you're getting these very big reactions, a lot of aggression that doesn't seem to dissipate, threats, even threats of self-harm, then those are the kind of situations where I would definitely recommend for you to get help. The other question that I want to address, this was again from your question, was how do we do this thing when we have a child who has another problem? whether they're diagnosed with autism or they're neurodivergent or they have ADHD, but they're also anxious. So does this apply for these kids as well? And the answer is yes, it does apply. It's just that we have to tweak it, right? Again, kids who have other issues, those issues need to kind of be sort of taken into account when we do these things. Maybe we do it a little bit differently. Maybe we try really, really small. Maybe we sort of get somebody to help us do it. But the concept is always the same, right? Whether your child has ADHD, whether they have autism, whether they're experiencing some other difficulty, they still need to learn to cope with anxiety. And learning to cope with anxiety is not about eliminating anxiety, it's about them learning how to work through it. So you need to figure out with them and with how you know your child and maybe with a professional who can help you, how can I help my child with these concepts in addition to the fact that they may be experiencing other things as well. Yeah. Shall we look at the questions?
Yeah, we have a question in the chat that says, when my child is really apprehensive of an upcoming event or situation, is it helpful to ask them to name the worst case scenario in an attempt to help them realize that even the worst case thing that could happen is still manageable?
Mm-hmm. The question is, are you asking them what is the worst case scenario, which is not really the question you should be asking them, right? Even we tend to want to do that. What is the worst thing that will happen? That they all make fun of you in school. But you know what? Nothing will happen. They'll make fun of you in school and you'll still be okay. But we don't need to even go there, right? We just have to say, I know it's hard. I don't know, maybe you will fail the test. Maybe they will laugh at you. But you will be okay. And we don't necessarily need to have that discussion. This is what Jana was trying to explain around the concept of addressing the anxiety and trying to understand the anxiety and to make sort of more rationalizing around it. That's not really helpful for children. It just allows them to think about it more and feel it more in a way that they almost have the sense that if you give them the right answer, then they'll feel better. But there isn't ever a right answer.
Mm-hmm. What if we decide to no longer accompany our child to the bathroom, for example? Do we just sort of hold this line and refuse to go along with them? And if so, if it gets to the point where they even sort of pee their pants, do we go that far is the question? Or do we address it? And if they do, how so? My thinking around that, first of all, I would want to know, like, how old is this child? How reasonable is the request? Remember, we talked in the beginning about developmentally appropriate. Is it an accommodation if this is something our child really requires of
7.
us?
I just saw in the chat, she's 7.
She's 7. Okay. So, I mean, we don't want our child to get to the point where they would, be so, afraid or overwhelmed that they couldn't go and they ended up peeing their pants. What we might do in a situation like that is we might break it down a little bit, right? We might not accompany them to the bathroom, but we might need to take a smaller step. We might say, I'm going to wait for you at the bottom of the stairs. My bathroom, I'm in line with my stairs in my bathroom. You can see me. Off you go. I'm here. I'm not that far away, but I'm not coming into the bathroom with you. So we want to just maybe take a smaller step in that regard. Maybe we walk them, to the bathroom, but we're not going to go inside with them, and we wait for them outside. And we gradually would expect to reduce that accommodation more and more over time.
And you can even make it smaller increments. You can even start by you just standing by the door. As you're still there, but you're physically away from them. Then you step out of the door, and then you're stepping maybe towards the stairs, but not quite at the going down, and then halfway down the stairs. It really depends on, again, on the child, their reactions, their age. You have to sort of feel it, like try it out. If you see that the reaction is so bad and your child is going to pee their pants, then you obviously have taken a bigger step than they can handle. Right? The success for them is also very important, that they manage, you are outside the bathroom and they manage to be in the bathroom on their own. That's success for them and provides them that sense of confidence. I did it, I managed to do it. Right? So it's important to have that experience. So Jana, I'm looking at the time. We are 3 minutes away. Let's see one more question. And there is a question about, we had quite a few about pressure. Kids who feel anxiety about pressure, to do well, high achievers. That was the sort of term we often use for kids who put a lot of pressure on themselves, not necessarily coming from anywhere else but themselves. And how do we address high achievers? So high achievers are really wanting, their anxiety is about not getting a good enough grade, and not succeeding and doing everything perfectly well, or whether it's homework, whether it's a presentation, whether it's a test. And that anxiety is just another anxiety, right? And the way we approach it is very similar. We don't have a discussion about what will happen if you fail and how this is not the end of the world. And we don't want to do that. We just say, well, this may happen, and allow them to fail. If we are in that situation where they're not going to, they freeze and they don't do the homework, or they come home and they refuse to do the homework, well, the homework will not be done and they will fail, right? And sometimes that is not a very sort of very good experience. But if they have that experience and then they realize that they don't want to fail, then you kind of break it down again, right? Maybe don't do the whole thing. Maybe just do one bit. Start with one little thing that you can do and leave it at that, and progress a little bit at a time in terms of their ability to function when they're feeling that pressure on themselves. So that's really in a nutshell. So I think we are out of time, right, Jana?
Yeah, we're 1 minute to go. I think one final comment that I would just pull from the chat, Zmira, is, Valerie writing as someone who works as a pediatric occupational therapist who works with children with anxiety, the power of teaching our children about their nervous system, and that there are books available to do so, like How to Train Your Amygdala. And it makes me think about how knowledge is power, right? For her, especially for our children, and the idea that it normalizes things, right? Our children can feel that I'm the only one who feels this way, but we have a biological system that's programmed to react to stress. So understanding that is a helpful tool as well, that will accompany all this supportive approach that we're providing you in this series.
We didn't address in this series the tools that we teach kids, the breathing, teaching them about our nervous system or other strategies, because that is actually something that's quite out there. A lot of times this is what we do. You can take a walk, you can drink some water, learn about how your body is. Those things, and we do want to teach kids to do that. We just didn't address it in this series because that is secondary to what we're doing. Those are tools that they will eventually come to use when we take away the accommodation and we are not doing it for them. Then they have no choice and they start accessing those tools to help themselves. I hope that makes it a little bit clearer.
Thank you, everyone, for being on this journey. As you know, all the recordings are available on the Learn Quebec website. We want to thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, and have a good night, and good luck with everything, trying to implement some of these things.